Hello.
Hey, how are you doing?
Good, good. And you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Where are you based at the moment?
In Sri Lanka.
In Sri Lanka, nice. Well, thanks for jumping on the webinar today, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. If you're expecting to see Flossie this morning, sorry, today you've got me. But today we're joined by Daniel, who's one of the co-founders of Blue Resources Trust, which is a research organization over in Sri Lanka. And their mobula project or fisheries project is an affiliate project of the Manta Trust, working on fish bycatch and fish monitoring in the markets in Sri Lanka. So just to go over some of the rules and stuff for this webinar, Daniel's going to talk for about 25-30 minutes or so, and then we're going to open up the Q&A session and put forward some questions to Daniel. So if you have any questions throughout the talk, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and just type in your questions there. Everyone's video and audio is on mute, so you don't have to worry about disturbing the presentation whilst you're having breakfast or whatever you're doing at the moment. The webinar will be recorded, and it will be available on our website as well in the coming days in case you want to share it with any friends or family or anyone that might be interested. So yeah, I think without anything else, we'll head over and let Daniel crack on with his presentation.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks again for having me on today. Okay, let's start this. All right, so hopefully you can see my screen now. So as Simon mentioned, my name is Daniel and I'm based in Sri Lanka. I'm the co-founder of Blue Resources Trust. And today I'll be talking to you a bit about the Manta and mobula rays, the Manta and mobula fishery that we have in Sri Lanka, and about the work that has been undertaken globally to protect them and some of the issues that we are still facing. So, as you may have heard if you have watched a few of the previous webinars, a lot of these species are facing severe population declines all across the world. In certain regions, mobula rays have declined by almost up to 99%. Manta rays have declined from anywhere between 60 to 80%, depending on where they're found in the world. And these steep declines have largely been attributed toward anthropogenic impacts. And the major issue that these species have faced has been from overfishing. And a lot of this is not necessarily target fishing. Of course, that depends on which part of the world that you're in. But for example, in Sri Lanka, the biggest impact faced by these species is non-discarded bycatch. And this is essentially when fishermen are going out to sea to catch other species like tuna, but they use particular fishing techniques like gill nets, which is essentially a large net that's placed in the water. And this catches pretty much anything that swims through it. So then you, of course, have species like the Manta and mobula rays, even turtles, dolphins, and a lot of other species that get caught in these nets. In contrast to species that are protected, like turtles and a lot of the cetaceans that are being released, what we discovered is that these Manta and mobula rays are being landed. And this is why we categorize them as non-discarded bycatch. So they're bycatch in the sense that they're not being targeted, but they're not being discarded at sea. They're being killed and brought back to shore. And this is to some extent similar for sharks in some of the fisheries in Sri Lanka. But one of the big differences with sharks is that there are still some target fisheries that take place. There are target fisheries, for example, for deep sea shark species when they're targeting for shark liver oil. There are some fisheries that are just targeting them opportunistically because of the value of the shark fins. Now, of course, you know, the first thing that one imagines when one is going out to catch fish in the ocean, that the primary reason for this is, of course, the meat. But what we discovered with Manta and mobula rays is that it's not just meat that's the primary driver of these fisheries. It is, the meat is quite rarely sold fresh. So this image is actually from one of the landing sites in Sri Lanka, and there are only about 2 or 3 local communities in the whole of Sri Lanka that even consume Manta and mobula meat. And in fact, most of the Manta and mobula meat is simply dried and sold as low quality dried fish, or dried and sold as animal fodder for farms. So of course, if meat is not the big driver, then there must be something else that's causing these fishes to catch or to kill these species and bring them back to shore. And what we realized was that there is this global trade for the gill plates of Manta and mobula rays. And as you're probably aware by now, the gill plates are the cartilaginous structures that you get inside the heads of Manta and mobula rays, which essentially are filters that they use to eat food when they're swimming. So as they're swimming, all the water flows through their mouth, through these filter plates, and the food gets filtered out of the water bottom. And what's happening is that these gill plates are being taken out of Manta and mobula rays, dried, and then exported where they're sold as Chinese medicine. And in contrast to a lot of traditional Chinese medicine, and of course, when one thinks of traditional, one thinks of something that's very old. For example, the rhino horns have been in traditional Chinese medicine for over 2,000 years. But when we conducted studies to look at how long ago they have been using Manta and mobula rays, Manta and mobula gill plates in Chinese medicine, we realized that it was only around the late 1960s. So it's not something that's traditional at all. In fact, it's something that was likely generated as an opportunistic marketing scheme, essentially, where somebody probably had a consistent supply of gill plates and decided to market these. And that's why they're quite often marketed as a cure-all. So they claim that it can purify your blood, it can cure measles, cures chickenpox, pretty much any ailment that you have, you can consume these gill plates and they will help you out. And of course, there's absolutely no scientific evidence to back up any of this. And in fact, some of the research that we have done shows that these gill plates are in fact detrimental to one's health, because they accumulate a lot of heavy metals, and one of them being arsenic, which of course we all know is a poison. But unfortunately, these species, just like sharks and rays, have very late maturity. So this means they take about 10 to 15 years in the case of manta rays just to become mature. Both manta and mobula rays give birth to just one single pup every 3 to 6 years in the case of mantas. In the case of mobula, we're still not very sure, but we assume that it's somewhere between 2 to 3 years at the very least. They have few natural predators in the wild, and they have incredibly slow growth rates. I mean, they can live, mobula rays live about 15 to 20 years. Mantas, again, it's a bit unclear, but we estimate at least around 60 to 80 years. And this means that when you have a slow-growing species like this, you cannot compare it to any other fish in the ocean. It's not like a tuna or something that gives birth to millions of spawn, every 6 months. What we have is a species that's a lot more similar to a terrestrial species. It can be closely linked, or let's say closely compared with an elephant or leopard, for example. And this means the moment you have any targeted fishing that catches a large number of these species, they will face population declines. And this is what we're seeing all across the world. And this is partly one of the reasons why I helped set up the organization Blue Resources Trust. So we essentially have a couple of focuses. One is on elasmobranch, which is what I look at. So we spend a lot of time surveying the landing sites. And we also do a lot of coral reef studies. But one of our main goals is essentially to act as a research platform in Sri Lanka to encourage more marine research to take place. And as part of this, what we have done through the fisheries project is to survey multiple landing sites across the country. So at present, we survey approximately 24 landing sites spread across the country so that we have a good geographical representation of the different species. And in addition to manta and mobula rays, because sharks are so closely related and since they often face similar threats, we're looking at all sharks and rays. And basically what we do is when we go to a landing site for a survey every morning, we will document every single specimen that we encounter down to species level and collect a lot of information as much as we can. So this information varies from measurements to tissue samples and all that. And what we have seen since August 2017, when we started these surveys in detail, is that there is a lot of biodiversity in Sri Lanka when it comes to sharks and rays. We have identified over 16,000 specimens at landing sites. And these have comprised approximately 89 species, split almost equally between the sharks and rays. And as you can see from this photograph, there's a lot of diversity. We have the electric rays, we have butterfly rays, guitar fish and wedge fish, a lot of sharks, and of course, the manta and mobula rays. And as I mentioned, what we do is we identify each individual to species level, collect information on the sizes, on the sex and maturity, and also any additional information that we can about fishing gear, location, price. We also collect tissue samples, which we use for 3 primary fields of study. One is basic DNA barcoding to be able to confirm the visual identification of specimens. We do population genetics. So this basically means that we take samples not just from Sri Lanka, but all across the Indian Ocean, for example, and determine how connected these different populations are. And using that information, we can get a basic understanding of the potential population size, which is quite important from a fisheries management perspective. And then we also carry out stable isotope analysis, for example, to see what they're feeding on. And this is supplemented with field work, for example, stomach content analysis, where we look at the actual guts of manta and mobula rays. In addition to that, a lot of our focus has been to try and get a better understanding of the age and growth of species, because again, one of the most, sorry, I think I'm doing internet troubles. Okay. One of the biggest issues that we face when it comes to managing these species is simply a lack of information. And a key factor for this, or key variable that is probably required, are thorough stock assessments. And for these stock assessments, we need a whole lot of different variables. This includes, for example, how many times an individual gives birth, how many pups, how long it lives. And it's not always easy to get this information from marine species. It's quite different to terrestrial species where you can just follow them over several months on land and document their behavior. Underwater, we simply cannot do this. So we have to look at a lot of different techniques. And this is where the data we collect at landing sites gives us a lot of information. All the measurements we collect gives us an idea of what their maximum size is, for example, or at what size they become mature. The tissue samples that we use can give us information on what they feed. And in this collage of images here, we are essentially doing age growth analysis. So we basically take the vertebrae out of rays and we slice those vertebrae. And it's actually similar to slicing a tree, and you see the growth rings. You get similar growth rings in some sharks and in a lot of the rays. And by counting those growth rings, we can get an idea of the maximum age of a specimen. And using all of this information, we are then able to conduct stock assessments to get a better understanding of how big a population is in a certain area. And that, together with the landings data, can be used to determine whether one is overfishing a species and resulting in population decline, what extent it would be sustainable to fish a species, and what policy recommendations need to be brought into place to ensure that one is not overfishing a species. We also do a lot of work when it comes to the identification of species. As you can see on the left-hand side, the 6 different images of Manta and mobula rays. A lot of them look quite similar. And this is again a critical issue with a lot of the sharks that we encounter at landing sites. So we try and compile species identification guides. And this is one of the guides that we produce specifically for Manta and mobula rays, which actually is available online for anybody to purchase as well. But of course, doing all this data collection is not sufficient if we are to do something about the actual declines that these species are facing. Because we're collecting information, we are understanding more about the declines, and what we're usually seeing is that these declines are incredibly steep and something needs to be done soon. And fortunately, a lot of governments across the world have seen this information that has been collected and have taken it upon themselves to try and bring about some positive change through global policy. So for example, in 2014, the government of Fiji listed both Manta and mobula rays under one of the UN conventions called CMS, which is the Convention on Migratory Species of Wild Animals. And this means that all the countries that are party to CMS would have to strictly protect these species and not catch them any longer. Unfortunately, while this happened already back in 2014, one of the big issues with some of these conventions is simply that there is not sufficient membership globally. So not every country is a party to CMS. And there are other issues, because of course, just because a country is a party to a particular international convention, it doesn't necessarily mean that they implement it in their own country. The country has to develop national regulations to implement these international conventions. And unfortunately, with the CMS convention, not many countries have done that yet. And this, of course, results in a lot of loopholes. And as a result of this, a lot of governments have then turned their attention to another UN convention called CITES. This one is a bit more of a mouthful. It's the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And it's sort of the larger sister convention to CMS. But one of the big differences between these two conventions is that while CMS can actually completely prohibit the capture of a species, CITES deals only with international trade. So the moment a species or a species product crosses an international border, if it is listed on CITES, it falls under the CITES rules and regulations. But the advantage with CITES is that it is a bit more stringent than CMS. It has a much larger membership. So there are over 183 countries in the world that are party to CITES versus just 120 odd countries for CMS. And a lot of countries implement CITES a lot better than they do with CMS. But of course, it's not easy getting a species listed on a convention like CITES. This is an incredibly large meeting with several thousand people that takes place every 3 years. And they're not there just to discuss Manta and mobula rays. They're discussing a whole wide range of animals, terrestrial animals, and plants as well. But fortunately, again, governments took it upon themselves in 2013 to list Manta species on CITES Appendix 2. And CITES, again, is a bit different to CMS. It has two appendices. Appendix 1 means that trade cannot take place, and Appendix 2 means that trade can take place if there is scientific documentation to validate that it is sustainable trade. And this is where the manta rays were listed in 2013, and subsequently in 2016, the mobula rays were also listed on CITES Appendix 2, partly thanks to Sri Lanka and a few of the other countries that really took the leadership to list these species. And this means that now countries have a lot of rules and regulations in place when it comes to trading these animals internationally. And this has an impact on species like manta and mobula rays, because as I mentioned at the beginning, these species are largely being targeted for their gill plates, which are exported internationally for the Chinese medicine trade. And it is at this point of export of the gill plates where CITES kicks in. And you basically have to present an export and an import permit, certifying that these species were captured in a sustainable manner and that any take of these species is not detrimental to the survival of the species in the wild. And this is quite an important thing, because for a lot of species like these highly vulnerable and threatened rays, it's not possible to scientifically provide information. It's not possible to provide sufficient scientific information to justify that it's sustainable. Because as I mentioned, when you look at the life histories of these species, they're incredibly conservative. And targeted fisheries for these species are simply not viable. And this means that a lot of countries will then have to start regulating the trade of these species a lot more closely. But again, that's not, the problem hasn't been solved with that. Just because these species are listed on CITES doesn't mean that countries can immediately start implementing all of this. When a gill plate comes at a point of export, how will the customs officials know that this is a gill plate of a manta or mobula ray? And for example, if a country decides to carry out enough science to show that a particular species is potentially sustainable for a certain quota of trade, how will they identify that particular gill plate from the gill plates of other manta and mobula rays? And it's these little issues that, while they may seem quite small and insignificant, can actually cause massive issues when it comes to implementation of these global conventions. And this is where organizations like the Manta Trust and Blue Resources Trust have done a lot of work to try and resolve these issues. So the Manta Trust developed this field identification guide for gill plates, which can essentially be used by customs officials all across the world to very easily identify the gill plates between manta and mobula rays. And now there are genetic toolkits available to be able to identify gill plates down to species level as well. And one of the things that we do as an organization in Sri Lanka is hold a lot of these implementation workshops, not just in Sri Lanka, but across South Asia and sometimes internationally as well, to provide these tools and training for different governments so that they have the capacity to basically implement these international conventions that they have signed up to. And this requires a lot of work and effort. But what we are seeing now, thankfully, is that a lot of governments are taking it up upon themselves to further the cause. Back in around 2013, when the manta rays were first proposed for listing, there was very little discussion about sharks and rays at meetings like CITES. It focused primarily on terrestrial species. And now, as the years go by, we're seeing this big shift where governments are seeing marine species like sharks and rays being incredibly important for protection. And this is something that's very, very positive. And as a result of this, we're seeing a lot more marine species, threatened sharks, being listed on CITES Appendix 2. And this is a very positive move, because the more species are listed on Appendix 2, the more countries will have tools and financial options in financial means that they can allocate to better implement the listings of these species. And we have seen this in multiple ways. For example, Sri Lanka has facilitated a lot of national workshops to improve identification, not just by customs officials, but also by fisheries officials. Sri Lanka joined the CMS Sharks MOU, which is another agreement that focuses specifically on sharks and rays. And just recently, Sri Lanka was one of the first countries in the, or was actually the first country in the world to implement an electronic permitting system for CITES, which will reduce any issues with fraudulent permits, for example, and also better help track the trade of these species internationally. And it's not just through national regulations or international conventions. There are lots of other regional bodies. For example, the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, which focuses on tuna. And now we are seeing, a lot more interest being put towards sharks and rays. And actually, the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission pushed through a resolution last year to look at fully protecting manta and mobula rays throughout the Indian Ocean. So it's incredibly positive to see governments taking it upon themselves to make this positive change. And, with this topic of trying to make things great again, we really should be looking at making the oceans great again. But to get back to my title, where I said, the devil is in the detail. As we can see, it's not just a very simple procedure of getting a species listed on an international convention or having a country even fully protect manta and mobula rays. A lot more has to be done to make sure that these rules and regulations are actually implemented on the ground level. And this is where research and a lot of the capacity building that organizations like the Manta Trust and Blue Resources does is incredibly valuable. Because we need a lot more research. For example, if we tell a country to prohibit catching manta and mobula rays and they're still using gill nets, what will happen? Will the fishers release them? If they release them, how many will actually survive? And to figure all of this out, we have to do a lot more research, because there's no point releasing them if they all die. And these are the little details that, like I mentioned earlier, may seem insignificant, but actually have an incredibly large impact on the survival of these species. But ultimately, we have to remember that all of us as individuals, we also have choices to make. And a lot of these fisheries, for example, for species like manta and mobula rays, are a result of global consumerism. It is our desire for cheap sources of seafood, of canned tuna, that's causing fishers in countries like Sri Lanka to go out and use easy techniques like gill nets, because they have to be able to supply tuna at a particular price for the international market. Whereas if we as individuals take the conscious decision to make a slight change, for example, we decide to only consume sustainable fish, which of course costs a lot more money, that money then can trickle down. And that makes it easier for organizations like us on the ground to go and tell a fisher, like, look, instead of using gill nets where you can catch 100 tuna, for example, use a technique like pole and line, where you will only catch, half the amount, but it's a sustainable fishing technique and you will receive twice the amount of money. So you will not have any loss. I'm of course oversimplifying it here, but that is essentially the gist of it. And by these little conscious decisions that all of us make across the world, it has massive consequences. And it can really help change an entire fishery in a country like Sri Lanka. benefiting, of course, not just the manta and mobula rays, the sharks, the cetaceans, and everything else that gets caught in these types of fishing techniques, but also all the fishers and the livelihoods that they rely upon. Because ultimately, a lot of people across the world rely on fishing for both their income and also as a source of economical protein. And that's it from me. Over to you, Simon.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Daniel. It was a super interesting talk. As far as sort of marine biology goes, everyone kind of thinks of marine biologists living the dream on the beach, scuba diving, snorkeling, but the work that your team does over in Sri Lanka is far less glamorous, but equally, if not more important. Working in fish markets with dead specimens, dead sharks and rays is not much fun. I've spent a bit of time over there with your team, and it's not very nice work, but it's super important. Thank you very much. We've got a couple of questions coming through already, which is great. First of all, a pretty simple one. I guess catching of these sharks and mantas and stuff like that in Sri Lanka, it's still completely legal, yeah? They're not breaking the law.
It's a good question, and it's a tricky one. I mean, technically, it is fully legal. They're not breaking the law. But as I mentioned, there is this issue because, for example, Sri Lanka is a party to the CMS Convention, the Convention on Migratory Species. And according to that, manta and mobula rays are listed on Appendix 1, which means we shouldn't be catching them. But as I mentioned previously, these international conventions only work if the country has national legislation to implement that international convention. Because ultimately an international convention is a framework and it provides recommendations to countries. It cannot impede on a country's national sovereignty. And as a result of that, if countries don't have proper or adequate legislation in place to implement, then it becomes a bit of an issue. And in Sri Lanka, unfortunately, we don't have legislation in place to implement CMS. So while technically the fishers and traders are not violating any national law at all, we are technically in violation to some degree of the CMS convention. And this is something that the government is working on addressing now, but it's not an easy process to bring about regulations to implement an international convention.
Excellent. Thank you. We've got a question here from Edward. He says, "Hi, Daniel. Thanks for doing this talk. I was just wondering whether there are any initiatives happening to either provide an alternative source of income to the people involved in the fisheries or to tackle the demand for the gill plates."
Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually have a slide on that. So alternatives. One of the big, questions is about sustainable alternatives. And in many countries, ecotourism is, of course, what's initially pitched because it's quite an easy and clean solution to some extent. So, for example, studies have shown that one manta ray, when it's dead, is worth only about $500, but when it's alive over its lifetime, it's worth about $1 million. The Maldives is an excellent example of this. They generate approximately $8.1 million a year from manta and mobula tourism. And these are figures, I think, from 2015 or something. So it's probably a lot higher now. But this depends a lot on each individual country. To be able to promote ecotourism, you need to be able to see these animals very easily out in the wild. And unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, the topography of our oceans around the country are not very conducive to this. In the Maldives, we have a lot of atolls and a lot of coral reef habitats which have cleaning stations where these manta and mobula rays either come to clean or they aggregate for feeding. So you have these areas where you can almost guarantee to see these animals. And in Sri Lanka, it's very rare that you encounter them in the wild. In the south of Sri Lanka, we have quite a bit of ecotourism surrounding blue whales. But even all those boats that are going out once or twice a day they very rarely encounter manta and mobula rays, and it's not something that you can guarantee a tourist to see. And this is where one has an issue, because if you are not able to guarantee an alternative, and that's the situation that we're facing in Sri Lanka. So we don't have a viable alternative, or rather ecotourism for manta and mobula rays is not an alternative viable. So we can look at other options. And the best option that we have come up with is to try and look at sustainable fisheries. So like I mentioned, to transition out of fisheries like gill nets that are catching these species to more sustainable techniques like pole and line, or using long lines that have bycatch mitigation for sharks. But all of this requires regards to the consumption of seafood. And the trade of gill plates being regulated by CITES, but also in the consuming countries in China, a lot of work is being done to educate people about these type of traditional medicines, that some of them don't really have medicinal properties, that some of them come from certain species, because ultimately a lot of the consumers don't even know what a gill plate is. They're just being given this when they go to buy it. You know, when they have an ailment, they go to a shop and they say, here, take this and eat it or something, you know, and they don't know what it is. They don't, or they're told that it comes from a fish. And honestly, if I was on that end and somebody told me it was coming from a fish, I wouldn't worry at all, because, you know, there are probably quite a lot of fish in the ocean. But yeah, that's where a lot more awareness and education has to take place.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, it's a tricky one when most people think of the best alternative livelihood as being tourism, but yeah, unfortunately that's not an option really in Sri Lanka, with mantas and mobulas at least. Another question here from Ben. He says, great stuff. In terms of CMS inception in Fiji in 2014, how effective is the work up until the present day? How CMS, has that made much of a change, do you think?
As I mentioned, one of the big issues with CMS is that there aren't sufficient numbers of countries that are party to it, and the implementation of CMS is a lot more poor. One of the reasons is that this convention is quite different to CITES. CITES essentially has an auditing mechanism in place in the convention. So if a country doesn't abide by its recommendations, other countries that are party to CITES can essentially blacklist a country. So you can say, you know, if just as an example, if Sri Lanka is not behaving and, you know, is exporting some species that is not sustainable, then other countries can say, okay, we are going to stop importing all CITES listed species from your country. And while it doesn't have a big impact on marine species, the fact is that there are lots of plants and timber trees that are listed on CITES. And this is where a lot of the economic revenue for countries across the world is generated. So the moment all the importing countries suddenly say, we're not going to import any CITES species, this means that the economy will face a downturn, because they're not allowed to export, for example, all their timber, which generates a lot more money than seafood. So this is one of the big differences. So CITES has this auditing mechanism in place. CMS doesn't have that, and that's the way the convention was designed. So it relies a lot more on countries having to take the initiative themselves. And this, unfortunately, hasn't been the case. But that doesn't mean to say that CMS is useless or something. It plays a big role because it generates a lot of awareness for these species, because by countries taking the step to list a species on a convention like CMS, which is not an easy thing to do, it shows that countries are taking it seriously and that this is something that has to be managed. Mm. And of course, again, there are lots of countries around the world that do implement CMS quite well. It just happens to be the case that Sri Lanka has a loophole with this particular convention.
Yeah, it's definitely a tricky one with these international conventions and how they're taken on board at a national level in different countries around the world. Closely linked to that, another question from Lorna. They've asked if countries are signed up to CITES and mobulas and mantas have been listed on Appendix 2. Are those countries subject to fines, or if they fail to adhere to the agreement, or is there any sort of punishment? I guess you kind of mentioned that with the
Yeah, I mean, it basically comes down to the auditing process. I mean, what we realize is that ultimately these conventions are just frameworks. You know, it's up to each individual country. So it comes down to how a country wants to portray itself internationally, whether it wants to be seen as abiding by all these international conventions. And of course, in a lot of international political deals, countries may offer aid to a particular country, saying that we will offer this aid on the condition that you're abiding by all UN conventions. And CITES and CMS are both UN conventions, so that then plays a role in it as well. So there's a lot of politics at play when it comes to these conventions internationally, but there's no clear fine or anything, because these conventions are run by countries themselves. It's a UN system, so yeah.
Yeah, and going back a little bit to the sort of in the field work that your team are doing. You mentioned you've documented 86-ish species of sharks and rays. Have any jumped out as something really unusual? Any sort of new species or anything that you wouldn't expect to have found in that area that your team have noted?
Yeah, that's been one of the most interesting things, because we just assumed that a lot of research must have been done. I mean, these are sharks and rays. There's a lot of research, or rather some level of research taking place in neighboring India and of course in the Maldives. But what we discovered was that there is actually little information known about this species. And out of these, need to check our checklist again, but I believe around 20 or 25 species were actually range expansions. So species that have not been previously documented in Sri Lanka. And then 2 years back, we ran a sort of rapid survey across the country through a collaboration with the University of Kansas, the University of Connecticut, and Dr. Dave Ebert, to look at the sharks and rays that are being documented in Sri Lanka. And we actually, once we ran the genetics, we actually found 4 species that are potentially novel species. So species that have not been discovered before anywhere in the world.
Wow.
And this is something that we are now working on to try and get more information on these specimens, to try and see if the genetics actually confirms with the morphology of these species whether they're actually distinct or not. So yeah, I mean, it's quite remarkable what one finds when one spends a little bit of time in these fish markets.
Yeah, that's awesome that there's potentially 4 new species come from that. I mean, I'm no shark expert at all, and I've been to some of these fish markets, and you see all these sharks lying out there, and on first glance, it's kind of like, wow, there's a lot of sharks here. And then you start to go around and look at them a bit more closely, and there's a number of different species and different areas of the market. They've pulled in different sharks of different sort of sizes, deep water sharks as well, pelagic sharks. It's yeah, I'm not surprised that you've documented 86 different species there.
Yeah, and I mean, now with modern techniques, like genetic barcoding and all that can quite easily be done. It's just revealing a lot more information. And actually, at the moment, we're just raising funds now to try and establish a genetics laboratory at our field station in Sri Lanka, so that we can do a lot of this in-house instead of having to export the samples internationally for analysis. So we hope that if or once we get funds, that we're able, once we set that up, we'll probably document a lot more species.
Yeah, and I guess it's just having time and people in the field at these fish markets every morning. I mean, you mentioned how many different sites your team visits, and yeah, it's pretty much every day of the week that they're landing sharks and rays. So having people in the field day in, day out, it's really important.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to one of your initial comments that, you know, when people think about marine biology, their instinct is, of course, you know, swimming in the ocean with dolphins or manta and mobula rays alive in a beautiful habitat, or looking at coral reefs. But there's so much that can be learned just by going to a fish market. And yeah, it's perhaps not the nicest part of being a marine biologist, or not what one potentially expects when one starts out in this field. But the information that one can gather is just incredible. I mean, you know, to think that we have seen over 80 species, I mean, this is something that's incredibly unlikely over a lifetime of scuba diving, you know, to see such high diversity. Yeah, and of course, you're not going to see deep sea sharks while scuba diving either. So while fisheries definitely have to be managed and a lot more has to be done to ensure that it's sustainable, it is also an incredible source of information.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a couple of questions on sort of similar topic regarding how you go about sampling the specimens in the fish market. So Tiff has asked, how do you go about gathering your samples and specimens from fishermen? Are they supportive of your research in the first place? And then is there a worry that you will contribute to the demand of these species? And another question, like, do you have to buy the sharks or rays off the fishermen, or do they give them to you, or how does that work?
Yeah, these are good questions. So the first one, a lot of it comes down to establishing good working relationships with fishers at landing sites. Ultimately, we are going into an area where they're working, and we have to respect that, and we have to make sure that we are not taking too much of their time, that we're not blocking their way. So these are all the considerations that we take. And we've been doing this, you know, I've been studying the manta and mobula rays in Sri Lanka since 2010. And we started this comprehensive elasmobranch program looking at all sharks and rays since August 2017. So we spent a lot of time in the field at, you know, these landing sites. So we've got to know a lot of the fishes, and that makes a big difference. And you know, they are aware of what we do. They are aware that we are collecting, that we're doing a lot of this research, that we are looking at how these species are being affected by fisheries. And yeah, we do not contribute to the demand in any way because we do not purchase any samples. So for example, the samples that we collect for genetics is normally just a very tiny, about a 1 centimeter piece of meat that we then store in ethanol. And that keeps for about 5 to 10 years. And we can do multiple analysis of a very small piece like that. So that we're able to just cut off from the dead specimens at the landing sites. It gets a bit complicated for some of the other studies. For example, the age growth studies. We have to sometimes take the vertebrae, so then we either wait until the fishers process them, because quite often the fishers are just interested in selling the meat or the gill plates or whatever. So for example, the vertebrae are quite often discarded or not considered very valuable. So the vertebrae, quite often they'll just give it to us for free. But it just requires a lot more time because we have to wait in the field until they actually process them.
Yeah, and I think setting up those local partnerships with the fishermen and keeping them happy is absolutely vital. I remember when I was with your project, the fishermen would actually call you guys when they had something that they thought you might be interested in, so that you could go down and collect your data. And I mean, if you make it hard for the fishermen, they're going to make it very hard for you, and you're not going to be able to collect any of this data, which is then vital for underpinning sort of conservation measures. So
yeah, exactly. And yeah, and I have to say, I mean, that's what's been most incredible. Like you pointed out, quite often they'll call us and give us information. And what we have to remember is that ultimately they have spent a lot more time than we ever will seeing these species. They have, you know, caught them, landed them, and, you know, they're at the fish markets every single morning for years and decades on end. And they have seen, you know, changes at markets with regard to species and all that information that, you know, it's very difficult for us to capture as a small research organization. So they're an incredible source of information as well. But of course, one has to take into consideration that quite often fishers like to exaggerate as well. So one has to be careful with the information they provide, but it is still very useful.
Yeah. On a slightly maybe happier note, do you ever get to spend time in the field working with alive animals?
It's a mix, unfortunately. Well, when I started out, I would say so, because I did spend some time in the Maldives, and initially while I was setting up a lot of these fisheries projects, it required me traveling to several countries, where then of course spend additional time to go diving with these animals. But lately, a lot of my time has been spent analyzing fisheries data, but also, unfortunately, in windowless rooms with policymakers across the world to try and figure out how best to manage these species to ensure that there is a sustainable harvest. So yeah, it's an interesting field to be in, and I guess one of the big takeaway messages should be that there are lots of aspects to marine biology if you're interested to get into this field, or if you're still thinking of what you should do. It's not just about swimming with live animals. That is a nice bonus or a positive side effect of this work. But you also get to travel quite often internationally, and yeah, it's a very interesting career. You meet a lot of different people, all the way from fishers at landing sites to sometimes even presidents of countries.
Yeah, and linked with that, we've got a question here from Hafsa. They want to know, what is the best way for people in Sri Lanka to get involved with the protection of rays, especially for young marine enthusiasts?
That's a good question, and I mean, there's no simple answer to this. I would say one of the easiest things that everybody can do, of course, is follow and support organizations like Blue Resources Trust and the Manta Trust, because ultimately one of the big issues that we have is the lack of awareness and education about these species. When I said earlier that fishers have spent a lot of time with these animals, quite often they're still not very familiar with the life histories of these species. And they were also quite shocked to find out, for example, that manta and mobula rays that manta rays give birth to one single pup every 3 to 6 years. And this makes them start to think, and then they're like, oh yeah, maybe this is why we're seeing less mantas over the years. It's because we're catching too many of them. So, while we always say increase awareness, and everybody's like, oh, you just keep repeating the same stuff, it actually does have an impact. And what organizations like us are looking for are young researchers who are interested to come and spend some time with us, learn about it, potentially help us reach out to schools in Sri Lanka, or even conduct awareness workshops for fishers and for their families. So this is something that we're quite keen on expanding. We are developing some educational materials at the moment. So actually academic curriculum, but also simple stuff like informational posters which compare species like sharks and rays with terrestrial animals like elephants and leopards, to show that they're not just any other fish. They have to be protected like we do with terrestrial animals. And I think this is where particularly young people have a large role to play, because old people are more likely to listen to young people. And I think that has a massive impact. And I think the voices of the youth are definitely going to help change the way the world functions.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anybody is in Sri Lanka or wants to help out or find out if there's any way to get involved in your project, I definitely recommend, Daniel's got all the links up on the screen now, so jot down one of those email addresses or visit their website and pop an email over to Daniel, and I'm sure if there's something available or some way you can get involved.
Yeah, please do reach out, particularly for Sri Lankans. We are very keen on supporting national capacity building. It's not to say that we don't support international students, but it's a lot more challenging nowadays with COVID in place to travel, but also with visas and all that. But one of the things that we really want to increase is national capacity to show Sri Lankans that there is this massive ocean surrounding an island that needs to be explored, that needs to be studied. And one of the things that we do is we try and provide scholarships for local students to enable them to do their bachelor or master's thesis research when it overlaps, for example, with shark and ray fisheries, or with our other field, which is coral reef sciences. Yeah, so we provide a few scholarships every year to various students. So that's something that you can apply for, and it's something that we are hoping to expand in the coming years. And generally, we are quite open to accepting a lot of interns and volunteers for shorter time periods as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Hopefully that gives some people some ideas of how to get involved and some inspiration. So that's great. Okay, I think we're running out of time a little bit. So we'll take one last question real quick from Lorna. How often do you come across mantas and mobulas in the fish markets? What's the kind of scale of the fisheries?
It very much depends on the type of landing site that we go to. This is again one of the little complexities that we encounter in Sri Lanka, because when you think of fishery harbors in the developed parts of the world, you think of one large harbor where all the boats come in and it's very easy to monitor. In Sri Lanka, what we are having is a combination of these larger harbors where there are multi-day vessels coming in. These are vessels that spend sometimes up to 3 months at sea. And then we have a lot of these smaller beach landing sites across the country. And, if you're from Sri Lanka or you look at a map, you'll see how small Sri Lanka is. But we actually have about 600 to 700 of these small landing sites across the country. So it's been a bit challenging for us to get an accurate estimation of the number of manta and mobula rays that are being landed. But what I can say is that at some of these large landing sites, so at the largest landing site in the country on the west coast, you would probably encounter one manta ray at least every 2 days, if not more frequently. And you would encounter probably about 10 to 20 mobula rays a day on average.
Yeah. Wow. So yeah, I mean, we're looking at a couple of hundred up to possibly 1,000 a year in terms of mantas.
Yeah, I mean, our conservative estimate at the moment is around 1,000 manta rays a year and about 30 to 50,000 mobula rays a year captured by Sri Lankan fisheries. And the Sri Lankan fisheries are probably one of the largest manta and mobula ray, like in the top 3 or top 5 in the world. So it is a significant fishery compared to the size of the country. But as I mentioned, it's largely due to the fishing techniques that are being used. And this is what we are working hard to try and identify suitable alternatives for.
Yeah, absolutely. And to put that into a little bit of context, I head up the Oceanic Manta Project. So it's only oceanic mantas that you get in the fish markets in Sri Lanka, but so far we've only documented 700, just over 700 oceanics in the Maldives or passing through the Maldives. And to think that up to 1,000 individuals are killed annually. Obviously we're very early in the research of the oceanic population in the Maldives, but it's the numbers don't look great considering the size and scale of the fishery compared to what population size is that we've documented so far.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, this is what, raises all the concerns of, not just people, but also several governments across the world that something has to be done soon. But yeah, it's not an easy thing changing an entire fishery of a country when we have about 200,000 fishers, and, it is ultimately a developing country that's struggles to make large, rapid changes.
Yeah. Well, perfect. Thank you very much for the super informative presentation. I think it really highlights everything, the work that you guys are doing, and it really sort of highlights the fact that I think many people would agree mantas and mobulas are worth protecting, but it's not as easy as that. It doesn't happen overnight. It requires a lot of baseline data in the field, both with alive animals and with dead mantas and mobulas in fish markets. And then fighting for legislation change when there's all these other endangered species and threatened species around the world that we're sort of not competing with for protection, but trying to get protection alongside. And then even once you get to that stage, there is still a lot more work to be done in terms of building capacity at a regional level, at a national level, to be able to enforce those rules and regulations. So yeah, although it sounds great, like let's protect manta rays, there is an incredible amount of work that needs to go into it. And as your presentation should suggest, the devil is in the detail. It's the more you look into it, the more small obstacles and hurdles you've got to get over and hoops to jump through before you can get to a stage where they are actually protected. Perfect. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who joined. Let me just get my screen up. So we've got a couple more webinars coming up over the next few days. On Friday, I believe, we have Sam and Tom from Ocean Collective Media. They are two underwater photographers based over in Ningaloo in Western Australia. So they're going to be giving a talk about the Ningaloo Reef. Obviously, when people think about Australia, most people think about the Great Barrier Reef over on the East Coast, but they'll be talking about Australia's other reef. So that'll be a really interesting talk to tune into on Friday. And then next week we head over to Indonesia. We've got a couple of talks with our affiliate projects over in Indonesia as well. For anybody in the meantime who's got time on their hands, wants to learn more about mantas and mobulas, I suggest you check out our website and social media pages, and also Blue Resources Trust. We've got lots of really good resources available on our website, and some other ways you can support conservation and research of mantas and mobulas. You can join our Cyclone. It's our members only sort of exclusive platform. You can adopt a manta, and lots of other different ways you can get involved in online as well. But please do check out Blue Resources Trust's website and social media as well. And look forward to seeing you on Friday for another webinar. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thanks again, and thanks to everybody who listened in.
Cheers then. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.